Hello friend, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. Brandon had always believed in sweat, the kind that came from doing the right thing, from earning your daily bread the honest way, even if it meant coming home bone-weary with mud on your boots and silence in your pockets. In the first 2 years of marriage, he paid every dime of rent on time, even when it meant eating beans and bread for a week. Amelia never complained. She smiled through rationed meals, kissed him on his forehead, and knelt by the bed every night to pray like a woman who had made peace with lean seasons. Their little bungalow on Pepperhill Lane wasn't the prettiest in Woodcroft, but it was home, a soft corner of the world where love covered their flaws like a threadbare blanket. The living room was always clean, with beige curtains that danced gently when the window was open, and the sound of Amelia humming while folding clothes filled the air like an old familiar tune. Brandon took pride in handing the landlord a check each month. A man must hold his house up with his shoulders, his father had told him once, and he wore that responsibility like a badge. The walls of the house bore witness to their beginnings, when they laughed over spilled milk, cried over lost pregnancies, and held each other like anchors in a storm. They had no children yet, but Brandon often pictured their son running down the hallway in socks, and Amelia laughing from the kitchen as jollof rice boiled over. But the months began to fold into each other like pages in a book that couldn't decide how to end, and Brandon's job at the school slipped through his fingers like sand, no matter how tightly he held it. One pink slip later, and the man who once stood tall now shrank daily beneath the weight of bills. Still, Amelia never judged him. She never rolled her eyes or threw words like stones. She simply continued to pray, to hope, to believe. But hope, when it lacks support, begins to rot in the corners of the soul like forgotten bread. There were nights when Brandon lay awake staring at the ceiling fan, listening to the creak of the blades as if they whispered judgments about his failures. Amelia's breathing beside him was soft and steady, but he felt oceans away from her. He tried hard not to let the struggle show, but the house knew. The wooden floors that once echoed with jokes and slippers now groaned with silent questions. He had taken up painting fences, fixing leaking taps for neighbors, even delivering parcels at dawn, anything to gather coins like a scavenger in a city of lack. Each month he scrambled to pay the rent, hands shaking, heart pounding like a drum at a funeral. The landlord, Mr. Green, was a quiet old man who only sent reminders through his lawyer now, a young sharp-nosed fellow with a cold stare and too much starch in his collar. Brandon hated the feeling of signing checks he could barely fund, hated the shame of pretending things were fine when they weren't, but he also hated the idea of Amelia seeing him as weak. Her father had been a military man, tough as nails and twice as sharp, and Brandon often felt like a soggy loaf in comparison. Amelia once told him she believed a man should provide no matter what, and he clung to those words like a vow. She didn't say them in a bitter way, more like a woman repeating an idea sewn into her fabric since childhood. Still, those words built a quiet wall between them. She never offered help, not even when he broke down in the shower, thinking she couldn't hear him. And he never asked. Pride is a hungry ghost. It eats you slowly and leaves your bones behind for the people who love you to find. Yet somehow, they kept pretending, both too careful not to poke the quiet elephant in the room. The shift happened on a Monday morning, gray and drizzling. Brandon was trying to fix the socket in the kitchen when a letter slid beneath the front door with a soft thud. He opened it with greasy fingers and read it slowly, as if the words might change if he stared long enough. It was from the lawyer again, a reminder about unpaid property taxes. His brow furrowed. Why would tenants owe property tax? He muttered aloud, a question that dropped like a stone into still water. He walked to the bedroom, holding the letter like it might explode. Amelia was folding bedsheets, her fingers gentle and slow, and he wanted to ask, but his tongue sat heavy in his mouth like a stone. He tucked the letter away in his sock drawer and told himself it was a clerical error. But the seed of doubt had already taken root. That evening, he rummaged through the shed looking for spare bulbs and stumbled across an old metal trunk tucked beneath a dusty painting. It was locked, but curiosity had a way of cracking open things not meant to be found. He pried it open with a screwdriver, and inside lay a stack of neatly folded papers. The smell of age clung to them like forgotten history. Titles, bank slips, a will with Amelia's name on it, all pointing to one unbelievable truth. The house was hers, the house he'd bled to sustain, the house that drained him. She'd owned it all along. He sat on the kitchen stool for nearly 2 hours, the document spread before him like a jigsaw puzzle of betrayal. His legs felt like they didn't belong to him, and his heartbeat drummed against his chest like a knock at a locked door. The kitchen clock ticked, but time felt frozen. He read and reread the name at the top of the title deed, Amelia Margaret Decker. There was no mistake. She hadn't just hidden a fact. She had watched him suffer and said nothing. She let him go hungry, let him walk in torn shoes, let him sell his wristwatch, all to pay rent on a house she already owned. The betrayal wasn't in the ownership, it was in the silence. He thought of every prayer she had whispered over him, every time she rubbed his shoulders and said, "It'll be okay." And maybe she believed it, but it didn't feel like love now. It felt like theater. He looked around the kitchen and suddenly saw it differently. The tiles he thought he'd helped maintain, the wall he repainted after their second anniversary, the curtains he replaced. He hadn't built a home. He had unknowingly worked for her estate. It wasn't the house that broke him. It was the secret that lived inside it. Brandon didn't sleep that night. His body lay on the bed, stiff as a log, but his mind roamed like a ghost through the walls of the house, brushing past the secret sealed within its bricks. The soft purring of the fan above did nothing to soothe him. It spun in circles just like his thoughts, restless, relentless, running nowhere. Amelia had dozed off beside him, breathing calmly like a child who had nothing to hide, nothing to regret. He studied her silhouette in the faint glow of the nightlight and felt a storm rising in his chest, a bitter wind curling up from his gut. The betrayal sat on his tongue like ash. He wanted to scream, to shout, to shake her awake and demand the truth, yet his lips stayed sealed. Confrontation had never been his tool. Brandon was the kind of man who built peace with bare hands, who avoided fire even when his feet were burning. But in the dark, with the truth now hissing like a kettle inside him, he finally admitted it. He was humiliated. Not just by what she had done, but by how long she had watched him bleed while holding the bandage in her pocket. Every rent payment he made felt like a mockery now, every late-night hustle like a staged play. He remembered pawning his grandfather's watch, the only heirloom he had, for rent money just last Christmas. The memory stung worse now, like someone had carved it into him with a rusted blade. The silence between them felt heavier than ever, so thick it could have been bottled and sold as grief. Morning came without warning, dragging light through the blinds like a thief in reverse. Brandon got out of bed before the alarm, made a pot of tea with shaky hands, and sat on the couch without sipping. Amelia strolled into the living room in her satin robe, her face fresh with sleep and trust, and smiled. That smile, so easy, so familiar, landed on his chest like a stone. "You're up early," she said, sliding into the chair across from him. He nodded but said nothing. The words in his mouth were too sharp to swallow, too dangerous to spit. She poured herself tea and began humming, unaware that the man across from her was breaking slowly, folding in places no one could see. Finally, she asked, "You okay?" Brandon stared at her as though trying to recognize someone from a photo taken years ago. "When were you going to tell me?" he asked, voice flat, eyes hollow. Her brows furrowed, lips parting slightly, but the silence that followed said it all. She already knew what he had found. "I wasn't hiding it to hurt you," she began slowly, but Brandon raised his hand. "Don't say that. Please." He stood up, pacing slowly, hands clenched like he was holding invisible wires. "Do you know what it's like to look your wife in the eye every day, knowing you're failing to provide? Do you know how many nights I beg God not for riches, but just enough not to be ashamed?" His voice cracked, but he didn't stop. "And all this time, you owned the roof over our heads?" She tried to explain how she was taught never to rely on a man, how she feared being left with nothing if the world ever turned upside down. "I needed to have something that was mine," she said. "I've seen women abandoned, Amelia, not betrayed," he snapped. "You watched me rot while sitting on soil rich enough to save me." Her face fell, the robe now looking more like armor than comfort. She opened her mouth, then closed it, realizing no apology would fix what had been undone. He left the house that afternoon, not to escape, but to breathe. The air inside felt laced with disappointment, the scent of betrayal trailing him like stale perfume. He walked the cracked pavements of Woodcroft with no destination, passing by shops that now felt too cheerful, people too unaware of the storm within him. Every corner he turned whispered the same thing: you were the only one who didn't know. He ended up at the small library near Riverbank Street, a quiet place he hadn't visited in months. The old man at the front desk nodded at him with the kind of recognition that didn't ask questions. Brandon sat near the window, watching the rain begin to fall in soft, rhythmic taps on the glass. He thought of his father, of how he'd once said, "A man doesn't fail when he falls. He fails when he stays on the ground. But how do you stand when the ground you thought was yours never belonged to you?" He wanted to forgive her, to see it from her side, but every time he pictured his calloused palms handing rent money to a landlord who was likely passing it to his own wife, it made his stomach churn. He pulled out a notebook and began to write, anything, everything, even nonsense. Words poured out like water from a cracked jug, raw and unfiltered. He didn't know what healing looked like, but he knew it didn't live in silence. Maybe putting it all down on paper would help him find a door out of this mess. Because one thing was certain, things couldn't go back to the way they were. By the time Brandon returned home, the house no longer felt like a partner in their story. It felt like an accomplice. The sofa where they had once fallen asleep watching movies now seemed too neat, too rehearsed. He walked past the hallway photos, Amelia laughing in a summer dress, him grinning with a barbecue fork, and realized he didn't trust those smiles anymore. They looked borrowed. Amelia sat on the edge of the bed, her eyes puffy, her phone resting beside her like a witness. She stood when he entered, unsure whether to speak or stay silent. "Are you leaving?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. He shook his head slowly. "Not yet, but I don't know where I am anymore." That truth hung in the air like mist. She reached for his hand, and for a moment their fingers touched like strangers meeting in a crowd. "Brandon, I love you," she said, but it felt like rain on a sealed window, soft but unable to reach. He didn't reply. Instead, he walked to the living room, lay on the couch, and stared at the ceiling, the same ceiling that had heard his silent prayers, his whispered fears, his crumbling pride. Tonight, he needed space not to leave, but to feel. Because healing didn't come from pretending nothing happened. It came from sitting in the ruin and deciding what still mattered. The days that followed unfolded like a long sigh, silent, heavy, and drawn out in stretches of aching normalcy. Brandon still took out the trash. Amelia still folded his shirts. They still shared toothpaste and towels, and yet everything between them felt like a performance staged for the walls alone. They moved around each other like polite neighbors who once shared something more. There was no shouting match, no storm of flying words or slamming doors, just the ache of too many unsaid things echoing through the hallways, like ghosts. Brandon rose before sunrise each morning, often sitting in the backyard with a cup of black tea, not because he liked the quiet, but because he didn't know what to do with the noise in his chest. Amelia began cooking meals with extra care, seasoning them as if taste could cover up time lost. She left handwritten notes by his wallet, short phrases like "I believe in you" or "You're stronger than this," but they read like lines from a play whose audience had left. He didn't throw them away. He just didn't reply. Brandon wasn't angry, not in the way people punch walls or throw glass. It was a quieter hurt, the kind that wraps itself around your bones and walks with you. Each time he looked at her, the same question circled back like a stubborn fly. Why didn't she tell him? Not once. Not when he begged God for help. Not when he broke down over rent. Not when he sold his wedding watch. She had simply watched. And love, no matter how soft it speaks, should never be that silent. One evening, as twilight stretched lazily across the roof, Brandon sat on the front porch with a pair of pliers, trying to fix a broken garden light. It was an old task he had postponed for months, but tonight his hands needed something to do. Amelia stepped out with a tray, 2 glasses of chilled Sobo and a bowl of roasted groundnuts, just like she used to bring him on days he mowed the lawn. She didn't say anything, just placed a tray on the step beside him and sat down, tucking her legs under her like a child. For a while, neither spoke. The only sound was the soft chirp of crickets and the gentle clink of tools. Finally, she said, "Do you remember our second month in this house? You painted the walls yellow because you said it felt like the sun lived here." He gave a small nod, but kept working. "I never wanted you to carry everything alone," she added after a pause. "I just thought, if something ever happened to us, if you ever left, I'd still have a roof over my head. I've seen what happens when women don't prepare for the worst." "So you prepared for war while we were trying to build peace?" She flinched slightly, but didn't look away. "I didn't think it would matter if things stayed good between us." Brandon chuckled dryly, shaking his head. "You didn't think it would matter that I was killing myself trying to protect what already had your name on it." The silence that followed was raw and sticky, stretching too wide to ignore. He leaned back on the step and whispered, "Love that hides to protect itself isn't really love. It's fear dressed in affection." Brandon spent the next morning walking to old places, the bakery 2 blocks away that still smelled like cinnamon dreams, the school playground where kids chased joy without knowing it, and the quiet bus stop where he used to wait for Amelia back when she worked night shift during their first year together. He didn't go searching for answers. He went looking for versions of himself. The man who once believed that honesty, no matter how small, stitched marriages together tighter than lace. The man who used to buy flowers even when bills were choking them because he believed in little things. That man had slowly vanished under the weight of provision, expectation, and silent sacrifice. Now he wasn't sure what was left. He walked into a bookstore on a whim, ran his fingers over dusty spines, and bought an old journal, leather-bound, pages thick and unsullied. That evening he began writing to himself, not to her, not to the past, just to the bruised man inside who still wanted to believe in loyalty without loopholes. As ink bled into the paper, Brandon realized healing wasn't loud. It was a quiet choosing. A choosing to stay, or to walk away. A choosing to forgive, or to let absence do the talking. And he wasn't ready to choose yet. But he knew this. Pretending to be fine was no longer an option. He wanted clarity, not comfort. And that required truth, unwrapped and untamed. That weekend, Amelia suggested they attend a counseling session at a nearby church office. "It doesn't have to be for reconciliation," she had said, voice cautious. "Just maybe we need someone to help us hear each other again." Brandon agreed, not out of hope, but because even endings deserved clarity. The counselor was a soft-spoken woman named Sister Janice, whose eyes carried more patience than pity. She didn't interrupt. She let silence have its say. Brandon spoke first, voice slow, but sure. He didn't raise accusations. He unwrapped wounds. He spoke of his father's values, of shame, of what it felt like to walk barefoot across months of silent sacrifice, only to discover the path was a lie. Amelia listened, really listened, tears sliding down her cheeks, hands twisting in her lap. When it was her turn, she confessed everything, how her mother drilled into her the fear of abandonment, how she once lived in a shelter after her parents' divorce, how safety meant secrecy to her. "I thought I was shielding myself," she whispered, "but I see now that I was building a wall so thick even you couldn't get in." Brandon didn't respond immediately, but something shifted in his posture. Not forgiveness, not yet, but something gentler than resentment. As they stepped out of the church building that day, the sky cracked open and spilled rain, not violent, but steady, soaking them as they stood in silence. Amelia reached for his hand, and this time he didn't pull away. He didn't squeeze back either, but he didn't let go. They had returned home from the counseling session dripping wet, both from the rain and the weight of unspoken questions hanging between them like clothes left out on a stormy line. The walls of their home felt strangely smaller that evening, as if the house itself was watching them try to fit into rooms they no longer recognized. Brandon walked in first and gently peeled off his damp shirt, tossing it over the back of the chair like it didn't matter. Amelia followed, silent, eyes darting from the soaked floor to the thin trail of water that marked their path. She grabbed a towel and bent to wipe it, and for a moment Brandon wanted to stop her, wanted to say, "Leave it. Sit down. Let's talk." But his throat locked again, and his pride stood at the door like a bouncer with folded arms. He went to the bedroom instead and closed the door softly behind him. Alone, he sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wardrobe, wondering when everything started to feel borrowed. Was it the moment he lost his job, or the moment he lost her trust? He remembered how, when they first moved in, they had danced barefoot on that very floor, laughing over spilled juice and unpacked boxes. Now the silence echoed so loud, it was like being trapped in a church after midnight. He pulled out the old journal again and wrote, "If two people live in the same house, but one carries a secret, are they still roommates or just neighbors sharing rent in silence?" And under that he added, "You don't rebuild trust by apologizing. You rebuild it by making space for pain to speak without shame." The next morning, Brandon took the car and drove to Greenway, a neighboring town he'd always passed, but never stopped to explore. He needed space that didn't smell like regret. As he drove past long stretches of open road, his mind wandered to the way Amelia had looked at him when she spoke about her past. There had been no drama in her voice, no tears she tried to force out, just raw confession, stripped of embellishment. He had seen her differently in that moment. Not as a schemer or someone who played him, but as a scared girl wrapped in a woman's body, trying to protect herself from an ending she'd witnessed too many times growing up. But pain, when passed down like family recipes, can poison even the sweetest intentions. He stopped by a small hardware store and picked up a few tools, claiming to need new bolts for the back door, but really, he just needed to feel useful again. He greeted strangers, smiled at old men playing cards on wooden benches, and for a moment, the weight on his chest felt lighter. Back in the car, he sat with the window down, watching a mother braid her daughter's hair in front of a tiny corner shop. That image lingered, how care could be so simple, so quiet. It made him wonder if maybe, all this time, they had both been trying too hard to protect themselves from each other. Like people sleeping with one eye open in a locked room. Maybe love was about laying down your weapons, even when you feared being ambushed. That evening, Brandon came home just before sundown. Amelia was in the kitchen, humming faintly as she stirred a pot of okra soup. The smell was familiar, nostalgic even, and it carried him briefly to simpler days. He didn't say a word as he dropped the small toolbox on the center table and sat on the sofa. Amelia glanced back, her expression unreadable, and continued stirring. "I found the old wind chime in the shed," he said, voice calm but deliberate. "It's rusty, but still rings if you shake it right." She smiled faintly. "You always liked that sound." He nodded. Another pause. "Do you want to talk?" she asked. He exhaled, long and tired. Not to argue, not to blame, just to breathe. They sat at the table that night, not as husband and wife navigating wreckage, but as two people trying to build a raft out of broken pieces. Amelia opened up more than before, about her fears, about how her mother once called her naive for trusting a man too much, about the time she almost sold the house years ago, but couldn't go through with it. Brandon listened. Not as a judge, but as a man unlearning the idea that strength always meant silence. When it was his turn, he told her about the journal, about how it helped him speak when his mouth refused to. And when they were done talking, they just sat. The food had gone cold, but the room felt warm in a way it hadn't for weeks. And that warmth, quiet and unsure, was the first thread in something new. For the first time in a long while, Brandon slept deeply. No dreams. No ceiling fan spinning guilt above him. Just stillness. Morning came, and the house was soaked in golden light, the kind that made things look softer than they were. Amelia was already in the living room, watering the small potted plant near the window, a plant he once nearly threw out, claiming it was dying. It just needed space, she had said back then. He remembered that now. And it hit him. Maybe that was them. Still green beneath the mess. Still possible. They went for a walk that afternoon, hand in hand, but not locked tight, more like testing the grip. They passed neighbors who waved as if the world hadn't almost ended. They bought a carrot from the roadside and laughed when Brandon spilled pepper sauce on his white shirt. It was nothing grand. No dramatic apology, no flowers or big gestures. But it was honest. And sometimes honesty is the most beautiful form of repair. That night, before bed, Brandon opened the journal and wrote, "We don't heal because we deserve to. We heal because somehow, even in the rubble, there are hands still reaching for us." He closed the book, looked at Amelia, and for the first time in weeks, said the words with no weight attached, "Good night, babe." She looked at him, nodded, and whispered back, "Good night." No promises, no guarantees, just presence, and for now, that was enough. The rhythm of their days had begun to shift, not dramatically, not like a curtain rising on a new act, but more like the slow thawing of ice under morning sun. Conversations were no longer trapped in small talk. Silence no longer felt like punishment. There was an unspoken truce between them now, a mutual understanding that healing couldn't be rushed and some hurts, even when forgiven, had to breathe before they stopped bleeding. Brandon had started working part-time at a nearby logistics hub, not out of desperation this time, but for structure, for the dignity that came with movement. Each evening he returned home and found Amelia waiting, not like a woman keeping score, but like someone learning to be present without guilt. She had made changes too, small but telling. She handed him envelopes when bills arrived, no longer assuming silence was strength. She invited him into decisions, even simple ones like which curtains to buy for the living room. And in those gestures, Brandon found a balm. Not because he needed control, but because he finally felt like he wasn't the only one carrying their home on his back. They didn't call it reconciliation. There was no ceremony or big speech. They were simply two people choosing, over and over, to try again. And though the air still held memories of wounds, it also held space for something better. Trust, perhaps. Or maybe just truth without shame. Whatever it was, it made the house feel less like a betrayal and more like a lesson they were still learning how to live through. One Thursday evening, Brandon arrived home to find a large brown envelope on the center table. It had no label, no sender name, just his, scribbled in Amelia's unmistakable handwriting. He opened it slowly, unsure what to expect. Inside were copies of the house's deed, a new will draft, and a letter. Not typed, not overly neat, just a handwritten note in her slanted cursive. The words didn't bleed with apology. They bled with ownership. She wrote of how she had spoken with a lawyer, how she had added his name to the property legally and irrevocably. "Not because I owe you," she wrote, "but because this house holds your footprints too, and because I want to be the kind of wife who trusts you enough to stop hiding behind backup plans." Brandon read the note twice, then again, and a fourth time. His throat tightened, but no tears came. Instead, a strange peace washed over him, not loud or triumphant, just steady, like a boat finally finding still water. Later that night, he sat beside Amelia on the porch, the envelope in his lap, and said, "I don't want it because of what I've suffered. I want it because now it feels like something we own, not something I serve." She leaned her head on his shoulder, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like a tenant in his own story. The stars above them blinked like old friends, and the house behind them stood quiet, no longer a liar, but a witness, one that had finally learned how to speak the truth. The following week, Brandon surprised Amelia with an overnight trip to Ivybrook, just 2 towns away, but far enough to feel new. They hadn't traveled in over a year, not since the job loss, and certainly not since the walls between them had grown tall. It wasn't a lavish escape, just a rented cabin near a shallow lake, a picnic basket, and a borrowed guitar Brandon had picked up from his friend Leo. Amelia packed light, smiled more, and during the drive, even sang along to songs they once danced to in the kitchen. At the cabin, they cooked dinner together and sat on the porch with warm mugs of cocoa. Amelia spoke of dreams she had buried, like wanting to start an online boutique for minimalist homeware. Brandon listened, really listened, not to fix or advise, but to hear her heart as it unpacked itself slowly. When it was his turn, he admitted how much shame had cost him, not just emotionally, but physically. "I aged 5 years in 5 months, he said with a soft chuckle. "Carrying the whole house on my chest almost crushed the man I was." They both laughed, but underneath it was a tenderness that wasn't there before. That night, wrapped under a single blanket, they didn't talk about the past. They didn't need to. The quiet between them was no longer brittle. It was warm, like soil finally softened for something new to grow. And for once, neither of them was looking over their shoulder. They had stepped into the present and found each other waiting there. The morning they returned to Woodcroft, the house seemed to welcome them differently. The front door creaked the same way. The smell of cinnamon still lingered from Amelia's weekend baking, but something had shifted. Brandon entered first and paused by the threshold. "Home," he said quietly, almost to himself. Amelia smiled as she walked past him into the kitchen, humming softly. Over the next few days, they rearranged furniture, decluttered the attic, and donated old clothes. Not because they needed space, but because starting again meant letting go of what no longer served them. Brandon repainted the front porch, the same yellow he had chosen years ago, and Amelia repotted the front garden with fresh marigolds. One evening, as they stood admiring the flower bed, Brandon reached into his back pocket, pulled out a folded piece of paper, and handed it to her. It was a poem. Simple. Honest. No rhyme scheme, just his heart written down. She read it slowly, blinking back tears. "You wrote this for me?" she whispered. "No," he replied, brushing a leaf off her shoulder. "I wrote it for us." That night, as they turned off the lights and slipped under the covers, Brandon didn't feel like a man returning to what was. He felt like a man waking up to what could be. And as Amelia rested her hand gently on his chest, where the ache used to live, he knew not everything broken needs replacing. Some things, when held with care, can be made whole again. The air in the consultant's office was calm, almost too still, as if it didn't want to disrupt the weight of what had taken root between Brandon and Amelia. It had taken months of unspoken gestures, quiet forgiveness, and the slow mending of what had been silently broken to arrive at this moment. Brandon sat with his back straight, fingers gently gripping a navy folder that held their new joint account documents. Beside him, Amelia carefully read through the home insurance policy, her face calm, her breath steady, no longer just carrying secrets, but carrying structure. Across from them, the young consultant with warm eyes and tidy locks clicked through the slides on a digital tablet showing their family financial map, a simple graph with bold lines pointing to stability, responsibility, and shared milestones. Behind her, pinned to a corkboard, was a crayon drawing with the words, "Our House," scribbled under a stick figure family beside his son. Brandon noticed it before Amelia did, and something shifted in his chest, not just a sigh of relief, but a silent nod to the boy in him who had once feared he wasn't enough. The consultant smiled gently, her tone even and kind as she explained the transition to dual signatory protocols, rent roll documentation, and insurance clauses. Brandon nodded, but his mind drifted briefly back to the attic, to the document, to the echo of betrayal, and how far they had traveled since then. Amelia's hand found his briefly under the table. It was small and barely noticeable, but the message was louder than thunder. She saw him now, not just as a man, but as a partner. The room smelled faintly of lemon oil and new carpet, but beyond that, it smelled like new pages being written clean, crisp, and honest. No more pretending. No more silence dressed up as understanding. What stood now between them wasn't a wall, it was a bridge. Carefully built, plank by plank, with conversations once feared and truths once buried. Brandon folded the folder gently and handed it back to the consultant. Amelia closed the insurance document and smiled at him, and he smiled back, not because everything was perfect, but because everything was real. The kitchen had never felt quite as alive as it did that morning. Brandon flipped plantains in the pan with practiced ease, the slices sizzling and curling slightly at the edges as steam rose to kiss the low ceiling. Across the room, Amelia placed slices of fresh-cut pawpaw on 2 plates, her wrapper tied securely around her waist, and her eyes bright from the soft, quiet joy of morning. Sunlight spilled through the window like honey, touching everything in golden patches, lighting up the small card beside the kettle that read "Rent cleared forever." The card had started as a joke, scribbled by Amelia on the back of a grocery receipt, but now it sat like a quiet trophy, a marker of victory that wasn't loud but was real. On the fridge, colorful letter magnets spelled U.S., a tiny declaration that felt more permanent than ink. The table was modest, 2 mugs of tea, a bowl of boiled eggs, a jar of honey, but the conversation was full. They talked about the new water heater they were saving up for, whether to fix the squeaky porch door or replace it entirely, and Brandon's plan to host a gardening workshop at the community center next month. Amelia chuckled when he talked about the compost pile like it was a second child. He loved that about her, that she laughed with her whole face, not just her mouth. He noticed things more now, not because they hadn't been there before, but because he was finally still enough to see them. She still had the small scar above her left eyebrow from a childhood fall, and her fingers still curled slightly around a mug, as if anchoring herself to something solid. The air smelled like plantains, lemon tea, and something else, something like peace. Brandon served the food and sat down across from her, their knees brushing beneath the table. They didn't say grace out loud that morning, but it was there, in every bite, every shared glance, every silence that no longer stung. Woodcroft's family day arrived like the first bright note of a song you didn't realize you'd been humming in your heart. The small neighborhood event, hosted beneath a wide white tent near the community center, was bustling with laughter and the clinking of soda bottles. Children darted between balloons, cotton candy machines whirred lazily in the background, and the older residents sat under canopies fanning themselves while trading playful insults. Brandon stood at the front with a microphone in hand, his patterned shirt swaying gently with the breeze. He'd been asked to give a short speech about rebuilding, about not just buildings and walls, but rebuilding trust, rebuilding relationships, and rebuilding from within. He didn't speak like a man who had all the answers. He spoke like a man who had asked himself hard questions and waited long enough in silence to hear the answers whisper back. His voice was warm, and he didn't perform. He simply shared. Beside him, Amelia held a clipboard and watched him with a softness that only someone who had watched someone grow could wear. Her dress was vibrant, the same color as the Zobo drinks being passed around, and her laugh chimed between conversations like wind against chimes. Brandon spoke about honesty, not as an obligation, but as an offering. He thanked the community for their patience, for the food drives when he had nothing, and for the prayers they didn't know they had prayed for him when he'd walked the streets with shame pinned behind his eyes. When he stepped down, applause rose, not the kind meant for heroes, but the kind meant for people who came back better. Amelia kissed his cheek, and he smiled, letting the echo of grace and growth ripple through the crowd. It wasn't a grand moment, but it was deeply good. The sun was beginning to set when Brandon and Amelia stood at the threshold of their house, not as tenants or survivors, but as people who had done the work. The sky behind them flamed in burnt orange and deep lavender, casting a soft glow across the neighborhood. Brandon's arm wrapped around Amelia's shoulders, and she leaned into him without thinking. It was muscle memory now, trust, closeness, healing. Beside the front door, a new nameplate read the Okoros, and beneath it, a tiny potted tree that had once sagged in neglect now stood upright, its leaves proud and unbothered by the wind. The inside lights began to flicker on as the porch bulb hummed quietly above them. Brandon squeezed her shoulder gently and whispered something that made her laugh, a real laugh, the kind that left no space for sorrow to hide behind. Inside, boxes labeled memories, and New Start sat unpacked near a new rug. A photo of their wedding day, once tucked in the back of a drawer, now hung proudly in the hallway. They didn't rush to go in. They simply stood still, letting the world around them breathe in tandem with their silence. This was their ending, and it didn't need balloons or choirs. It needed only this, two people who stayed when leaving might have been easier. Two people who told the truth when it cost them comfort. Two people who learned that a home is never just a building. It's the forgiveness you choose, the hand you hold, and the quiet promise of trying again. Sometimes, the deepest cracks in love are not caused by fights or distance, but by silence, fear, and the secrets we think we're keeping for good reasons. If you're building something with someone, let truth be the foundation. Share the burden. Speak even when it feels awkward. And don't wait for things to fall apart before you make space for each other's truth. A relationship where one person carries everything alone is not strength. It's imbalance wearing a brave face. Heal together, grow together, and never forget, honesty doesn't weaken love, it deepens it. May your home be a place where peace speaks louder than pride. May your love be anchored in truth, not trapped in secrets. May you never have to bleed to prove your worth. And may your sacrifices never go unnoticed. I pray that wisdom will dwell in your heart, understanding in your words, and grace in your actions. May God give you the courage to speak even when silence feels safer, and the humility to listen even when your ego wants to shout. May your journey be light, your union be whole, and your days be filled with laughter that doesn't hide pain, but heals it. If you've ever been broken, may you rise with clarity. If you've ever hidden your truth, may love invite you to uncover it without shame. May your tomorrow be softer than your yesterday, and may your home, wherever it stands, be full of warmth, joy, and purpose. In Jesus' name, amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.